Welcome back! Today I'm going to be looking at Paradiso, Cantos 10 through 13, which is a bit to get through. But this is where Dante is on the sun. I'm walking on the sunshine, whoa, whoa, whoa! And don't it feel good? A lot of people have noted that this is a transition canto for Paradiso, but not only Paradiso, also Inferno and Purgatorio, Canto 10 was a transition. In Inferno, we transitioned from the sins of incontinence, those sins that were done without control of the will, to those sins that were the willful kinds of sins, which made up the rest of the Inferno. In Purgatorio, we had the transition from those in the anti-Purgatorio with those on Mount Purgatorio proper. Those souls who are waiting outside for their chance to enter the mountain, with those souls who are actually being purified and purged of their sins. In Paradiso, we have a transition as well. Up to this point, we visited 3 different planets, the Moon, Mercury, and Venus, and all 3 of those have been in shadow. In other words, the souls there demonstrated a sense of failure that they managed to overcome and rise above. But now that we're on the sun, we are touching the light, and from here on out, everything is going to be aglow, and we're going to focus on perfection. The major idea or virtue focused on in the realm of the sun is the idea of wisdom. And we're going to be exploring wisdom in some interesting ways. Dante starts with an invocation of the Trinity. Gazing on his son with the love, the one and the other eternally breathe forth, the inexpressible and primal power, made with such order all things that revolve, that he who studies it, in mind and in space, cannot but taste of him. With me then, reader, raise your eyes up to the lofty wheels, directly to that part where the one motion and the other intersect, and from that point begin to gaze in rapture at the master's work. He so loves it in himself that never does his eye depart from it. So Dante starts with the image of the Trinity, and how the Trinity not only is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but also reminds us of wisdom, power, and love as 3 ideas. Those 3 ideas were introduced back at the beginning of Inferno as well. They were on the door of the Inferno. And here that's reiterated. And throughout that, we're going to see that wisdom is what makes up the universe. God's wisdom comes out in the art of his creation. And by looking at it, we gain some kind of wisdom. Dante points out in this next section how the sun and the earth interact, and the angle of the sun and the angle of the earth allows for the differences in seasons and the differences in times, and how all of that works perfectly to allow for life and vitality of the earth. If we didn't have day and night, springtime and harvest, life on earth would be so much harder, and perhaps even impossible. And if their pathway were not thus deflected, many powers in the heavens would be vain and quite dead, almost every potency on earth. And if it slanted farther or less far in the upper or lower hemisphere, much would be lacking in the order of the world. So we see the idea of wisdom in God's creation as Dante wonders at God's creation and invites the reader to feast on the beautiful wisdom that comes from God's creation. But also we see that the idea of wisdom is connected to parts working together well. And that's going to be a key idea through the rest of this section. And he invites the reader to continue to contemplate the sun and what wisdom can be gained in observing the way nature works there. But he's going to move on to his actual subject, which is describing the next part of his journey. He arrives, as with the other sections, without even realizing it, and he looks around at the beauty of the light that he sees there, and already he's calling up the idea of ineffability. Were I to call on genius, skill, and practice, I could not ever tell how this might be imagined, even if one believes and longs to see it. And if the powers of our imagination are too earthbound for such height, it is no wonder, for eye has never seen light brighter than the sun. And the light of the sun reminds him of the light of God, and as he thinks of the light of God and looks up to God, he for a moment forgets Beatrice. Notice how this parallels the previous section where he was reminded of his forgetting of Beatrice and how much of a problem that was at the top of Mount Purgatory, reflected back in his work, The Convivio. But here, Beatrice appreciates it because he's forgetting her for the sake of turning towards God, which is a greater beauty. This did not displease her. Instead, she smiles. The splendor of her smiling eyes divided my mind's focus among many things. And then we have a circle of souls who, shining brightly like lights, come around them and dance in a circle around them. And Dante comments a whole lot on the way the souls dance together in a unified dance. And also then, the first soul who speaks to him comments on how his reflection of their love adds to it. Since the ray of grace by which true love is kindled, and which by loving sees itself increase, multiplied in you, is so resplendent that it conducts you up that stair, which none descends except to mount again, he who would deny your thirst the wine out of his bottle would not be free to do so, as water has no option but to flow into the sea. Notice how Dante's joy is working with the joy of these souls here. Dante also drops the hint that he's definitely bound for heaven at this point, because no one gets this high if he's not going to ultimately come back. The soul that he's speaking to here, though, is Thomas Aquinas, which is a very important theologian of the church. Thomas Aquinas then goes on to introduce the rest of the 12 there circling them. And we see some connection between all of these different souls. Most of them are scholars of some sort, or at least great theological thinkers. There's a lot of wisdom emphasized here. But not all of them entirely. And also Thomas, before introducing himself, introduces his order, the Dominican order, and he introduces his teacher, who is standing beside him. Robert Hollander's really fantastic notes over Paradiso comment on the connection between Thomas Aquinas as a hero and Ulysses as a hero back in Inferno. And there are some parallels in their language and in the way they are presented, but also some very strong contrasts. It's Ulysses' pride that's really emphasized, where it's Thomas's humility emphasized here. He talks about his order before introducing himself, as I said. He says, I was a lamb among the flock led by Dominic along the road where sheep are fatted if they do not stray. And that idea is going to come back in just a moment. Another really interesting person that we note here is King Solomon, who is known for his incredible wisdom. But he's also something of a problematic figure, because later in his life he had some serious problems that ultimately led to the splitting of the kingdom. Thomas calls him the most beautiful among us, breathes forth such love that all the world below is greedy to discover how his soul has fared. Within his light there dwells a lofty mind, its wisdom so profound, if truth is true, there never rose another of such vision. He points out that everyone really wants to know what happened to Solomon. Did he come out of this all right? Did he go to heaven? Or did ultimately he succumb to his greed and his distraction with women? But also Thomas says there never rose another of such vision. And that idea is going to have to be explored a little bit further. Canto 10 concludes as Thomas wraps up the introductions of all of these souls, and there's this image of this circle, this ring, as a clock. And Dante introduces Canto 11 with a list of things that distract you from wisdom. The foolish cares of mortals that get in the way of our functioning in a way that is wise. And Dante has 2 points that he wants clarified on what Thomas just said. He doesn't ask these questions because Thomas can see them within him. Even as I reflect its radiance beams, so gazing into the eternal light, I grasp your thoughts and the source of their beginnings. You are in doubt and would have me restate my words to make them clear and plain, matching the level of your understanding. As when I said, where sheep are fattened, as well as, nor was there ever born another. So Thomas is going to explain both those statements. However, he's going to take a break in between them. The first statement he's going to clarify is his comment about the Dominican order. His comment about how sheep are fattened under the Dominican order unless they go astray. And then he's going to go on further after that in Canto 13 to talk about his statement that there has never been born another like Solomon. And his comment on the Dominican order is going to be done in a very unique and strange way. He's going to talk about how in the church, when there was need, 2 orders rose at the same time, the Franciscan order and the Dominican order. St. Francis and St. Dominic. And the work that these two did of reforming the church was going to be of incredible importance. Their work was a demonstration of wisdom. And because they both arose at the same time and were of equal importance, instead of talking about Dominic, although Thomas is of the Dominican order, he's going to talk about St. Francis. I shall speak of one, since praising one, whichever one we chose, is to speak of both, for they labored to a single end. And we see that idea of working together as a kind of wisdom. So to speak of one part is to speak of the beauty of the whole. And so Thomas, a Dominican, speaks of St. Francis. This is going to be mirrored in the next canto, in Canto 12, when Bonaventure, who is a Franciscan, is going to speak about St. Dominic. Thomas Aquinas describes the marriage of St. Francis not to a woman, but to Lady Poverty. And it was his love of poverty that ultimately led to the goodness and the wisdom that he had. Thomas says that he found unknown riches and prolific good in embracing poverty. And Thomas finishes his description of St. Francis' life by commenting on the way the church has not followed in the pattern of St. Francis, and how some of the leadership, hint hint Boniface VIII, have not been interested in a love of poverty, but instead have been greedy and self-indulging. And he concludes by returning to his comment, "See how the sheep can be fattened if they do not stray." You are enriched by the kind of goodness and wisdom that you learn from an example of Francis. He also introduces here a gardening image, which is going to be picked up by Bonaventure in the next canto and used to describe at length Dominic's work. As soon as Thomas Aquinas finishes speaking, the second circle comes and surrounds them. And so we have the first circle of 12 souls, and then the second circle of 12 souls, 24 souls in all, a fairly significant number throughout Christian tradition. And Dante spends several lines describing the way the two rings function together and interact and dance in a unified way. He describes it like two eyes that blink in a unified way, how one eye will always function with the other eye. Another circle closed in, matching it motion for motion, song for song, song that heard from such sweet instruments as far excels our muses and our sirens, as a first shining its reflected rays. As twin rainbows, parallel in shape and color, arc in their pathway through translucent clouds when Juno gives the order to her handmaid. And Bonaventure steps forth from this second circle and he says, "The love that makes me beautiful bids me, in turn, to laud that other leader, because of whom my own has won such praise." So since his leader, St. Francis, has been praised, he's going to praise the other leader, Dominic, who is Thomas Aquinas' leader. And Dominic is known not for his embracing of poverty, but of his embracing of truth, and how he sought to weed out falsehood in the church. He was called Dominic, and I shall speak of him as that laborer chosen by Christ to help him dress and keep his garden. He began to travel through the vineyard, which quickly withers if the keeper is corrupt. And it describes over and over again this gardening image of him cropping out the weeds of heresy and instead cultivating the truth. And it says ultimately that for the privilege of fighting against the errors of the world, thus to preserve the seed of the 24 plants now wreathing you in light. So these 24 souls who are in this double circle that Dante is seeing here represent this wisdom that can be passed forward. And here Dominic was urgently searching to preserve that wisdom, the seeds of that wisdom in the church. But just as some of the members of the church after the passing of St. Francis have turned back to greed, so also members of the church have turned back to error. The leadership focusing on itself and self-serving ideas instead of the truth. His family, which started out setting their feet upon his footprints, is now turned backward, setting their toes or once they placed their heels. Soon that harvest of bad tillage shall occur, when the tares complain that the barn is shut against them. The garden's going to rot unless we continue to uphold the truth. And Bonaventure goes on to then point out who all the other souls in his circle are. Some of whom were not brilliant theologians, but who were eager followers of St. Francis. And again, it's all about that idea that working together produces wisdom, not just my own introspection necessarily. Canto 13 begins with another dance of the two circles, and the two circles begin to move in different patterns. They actually split into 3 groups They actually then mix together and work together and split into 3 groups for a short time to demonstrate the idea of the Trinity. And now Thomas returns to speak to Dante again and to answer the second problem that he had introduced back a few cantos. And that is the problem of Solomon. And so we conclude our discussion of the Son and wisdom by talking about the man who is known for being the world's wisest man. And the problem that Thomas sees in Dante's eyes is the idea that how can Solomon be the greatest man when after all there are Adam, who is the first man, and Jesus, who was the perfect man? And Thomas clarifies, first of all, introducing this sort of Platonic idea of copies, that all of humanity is imperfect, and most of us are copies, and imperfect kind of copies, of the first man who was perfect, and Christ, who was divine, also perfect. If the clear vision of the primal power is moved by burning love and makes of that its seal, then all perfection is attained in it. In that way was the dust made ready to receive once perfection in a living creature. In that way was the virgin made to be with child. Thus do I agree with your opinion that human nature never was, nor shall it be, what it was in these 2 creatures. How then is Solomon without equal? Well, he is without equal among kings in his wisdom, is what Thomas clarifies. Therefore, if you reflect on this and what I said, kingly prudence is that peerless vision on which the arrow of my purpose strikes. And if you examine my use of rose with open eyes, you will see that it referred alone to kings, of whom there are so many, but the good ones rare. Take my words along with this distinction, and they can stand alongside your beliefs concerning the first Father and the one we love. And then Thomas concludes this discussion by talking about being careful and being wise in your decisions. Don't jump to conclusions, but make careful distinctions. Let this always be as lead upon your feet to make you slow, just like a weary man in moving, whether to yes or no, unless you see both clearly. Once you get a false idea in your head and then it really latches onto you and fetters you, you're going to come into a serious problem. And that is foolishness. So be wise, be wise. The Son is an area of wisdom. We're going to conclude the Son in our next discussion as we move into Canto 14. Dante, before leaving the Sun, is going to have a quick talk about light and the brilliance of light that he sees as he moves on to Mars. So until next time, thank you for watching, and I hope that you will be wise and discerning in all that you do. I will see you as Dante ascends to Mars. Bye-bye.